I don't think we have all the answers, but I think we have a major answer here in California. I think it's very fitting that today is the observance of Veterans Day. Veterans Day was actually yesterday. Today is the day, at least in the United States, and I understand from James that they're celebrating Armistice Day in Great Britain. But I think one of the things, if you look back about why so many of our veterans fought and so many of them died, was to preserve certain core liberties. And I think certainly property rights are at the core of the things that we hold very precious here in the United States. As some of you may know, the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association is leading a coalition of property rights organizations seeking passage of a statewide ballot measure, the California Property Owners and Farmland Protection Act. Let me just tell you some specifics about our effort. This measure will appear on the June 2008 primary election. We submitted our measure to the Attorney General on May 1st of this year. We need 694,000 valid signatures, which means we actually need to turn in a little over 1 million to ensure qualification. As of last Friday, we're almost there. We have about 950,000, and our turn-in date will be coming in either at the end of this week and next week. We are on track to qualify. So finally, Californians will have the opportunity to vote on significant property rights protections come June. And we do represent a broad coalition of supporters who believe that property rights are not only as important as civil rights, but that property rights are civil rights. The primary purpose of our initiative is to provide protection to property owners against eminent domain abuses. But we have known for a long time that there's a lot of different ways government can take your property. They can seize it outright, of course, or they can simply limit the purchase price or release price of property. In other words, government can physically take your property for some reason that it believes is in the public interest, vision, I guess you would say, or they can make you, the property owner, bear the public burden without government actually taking the title of the property itself. For that reason, our measure, in addition to addressing eminent domain abuses, would also phase out rent regulations in California through permanent vacancy decontrol, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But I think as we all talk about the specifics of any proposal, we need to keep in mind some of the broader purposes of property rights, not only throughout America, but here in California. The Constitution of the state of California, in its opening line, provides that all people by nature are free and independent and have inalienable rights. Among these are enjoying and defending life and liberty, acquiring, possessing, and protecting property. The primacy of property rights, among other rights, is thus expressly recognized by the United States Constitution, but even more specifically here in California. The power of eminent domain, as we all know, is the power of government to take your property even when you want to keep it. But both the United States and California constitutions prevent government from taking property for public use without the payment of just compensation. Thus, in theory, government can take your property when it satisfies two conditions, that they pay for it and that they put your property to some public use. Unfortunately, as we all know, courts have slowly been eroding these protections. One of the most egregious injuries to this fundamental constitutional protection is the virtual elimination of the public use requirement. Historically, government could only take property for public uses such as roads, easements, fire stations, parks and schools, things like that. But as we also know, courts have changed what is public use into a public purpose requirement. This new public purpose requirement no longer requires government to use the property, but simply to articulate some public benefit that will be achieved by taking private property. And this, of course, this can be done even when government is not going to use the property. Governments now allow the taking of private property in order to transfer the property to another private party, as long as the government can state some public benefit, which of course includes the generation of higher tax proceeds. No conflict of interest there. In a case that shocked the conscience of this nation, Kelo versus City of New London, a family that had occupied and owned a house for over 100 years were forced out of their home So the city of New London, Connecticut could have implemented an economic development plan that would result in greater tax proceeds. And you've heard this case unless you've been living on Jupiter. Thus, under current guidelines set by the United States Supreme Court in Kelo, municipalities can seize any private property, even to transfer it to a third-party developer. But I think it's very important to note what the U.S. Supreme Court did and did not do. This was not a mandatory requirement on all states. Merely it set what it considered to be the minimum level of protections under the federal Constitution, thus leaving it up to states or local governments to provide additional protections if that's what they wanted to do. And of course, this decision was so controversial, 5-4. By the way, if you ever get a chance to read the dissents in that case, they are wonderful overviews of the importance of property rights in the United States. But the resulting firestorm from the Kelo decision left many states to adopt, either through state laws, state constitutional provisions, far more protections than that recognized by our 9 justices of the U.S. Supreme Court. Here in California, several local governments, both cities and counties, have adopted laws stating that they, as a matter of policy, simply will not seize property through the bludgeon of eminent domain for the purpose of economic development. One of the best cases, and this is an individual I met with last week, Kurt Pringle, the mayor of Anaheim. They have a very aggressive redevelopment program in Anaheim, but they do not use eminent domain. They will develop and revitalize downtown areas, but they will not take property away from somebody simply to give it to somebody else. At the state level, unfortunately, it's been a different story. The legislature, while nibbling around the edges, has failed to provide meaningful protection. For that reason, a variety of property rights advocates put Prop 90 on the ballot last November. While Prop 90 would have prevented these what we call Kelo takings, it also delved quite deeply into the area of what we call regulatory takings. And regulatory takings are, of course, when government regulates property, not to the point of taking it outright, but certainly depriving it of value. Here in California, the political dynamic is much different than it is in Florida or Alabama or Texas. We have a very strong environmental influence here in California. I'm not sure that was entirely appreciated by the proponents of Prop 90, and the opponents, the League of Cities, as you mentioned, and their environmental allies were able to convince California voters that Prop 90 went too far. Now, understand that there were some drafting issues with Prop 90. Understand that during the campaign, the opponents of Prop 90 outspent the proponents on a 12-to-1 basis on voter contact, and a lot of things went wrong with the yes side. Despite everything that went wrong, Prop 90 just barely failed, 52-48. That very minor, very shortly missed victory tells us that the issue of property rights is not dead in the state of California. Because of that, and because my organization, the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association, believes very strongly in protecting homeowners, we came together with the California Farm Bureau Federation, the California Alliance to Protect Private Property Rights, and most recently I'm very happy to report that the National Federation of Independent Business, NFIB, has joined our effort. Very powerful coalition of small business, not the big boys, small business. And our coalition is the California for Property Rights Protections, and our committee is registered, of course, with all the appropriate state agencies under the Fair Political Practices Act for the purpose of passing our initiative in June of '08. Our goal was to draft a property rights amendment to the California Constitution, but to avoid some of the pitfalls of the earlier efforts, we seek to reassert our rights as citizens, protecting current and future property owners from unjust property seizures by local government under the auspices of whatever they consider the public good, or as Lorraine says, this vision thing. Our initiative, what does it do? It provides private property cannot be taken under eminent domain for private use, i.e. To build a retail mall, auto mall, or industrial park. This includes not only single-family dwellings, but small businesses, agricultural lands, and places of worship. Churches are prime targets for redevelopment because they're tax exempt and they generate no tax revenue, so they're easy targets. Property can only be taken by eminent domain for truly public uses. Property cannot be taken and used for the same purpose that the private property owner is putting the property. In other words, if you've got a small apartment building and the government says, well, we want to seize your apartment building and use it for affordable housing, that's the same use. You can't do it. Because if you're operating it and you're within code, it's not a nuisance, there's no criminal activity, this is not a crack house. If it's a profit-producing apartment building, government shouldn't be able to take it and use it for the same purpose. Likewise, government should not be able to look at a private water company who's within the compliance of the Public Utilities Commission and have a local county say, you know what, we could make money if we took over that private water company. If the public water company wants to take over the private water company and put it to the same use under our initiative, even if they want to pay for it, they can't do it. Because this is ever encroachment of government over private lands. And finally, because we recognize that there are many different ways government can take property, we say that government cannot regulate either the sales price or lease price of property. While differing from Prop 90 in the manner in which regulatory takings are addressed, as I mentioned, we do get rid of the regulations over the price of property is either sold or leased. While our opponents will surely accuse us of trying to take away affordable housing, the fact is that these regulations, unlike run-of-the-mill zoning, land use planning, and other harmful restrictions, are horribly damaging to a host of property owners. The Act seeks to protect homeowners, family farmers, and small businesses alike. The bottom line is that the sales price regulations and rent regulations are fundamentally unfair. Local government should not be permitted to set the price for which homeowners and other property owners choose to rent or lease their home. As a property owner, you should have the right to decide how much to charge to lease your property, and then individuals can choose whether or not they want to pay that asking price. I think another important point needs to be made here. Rent control is only existent in a few jurisdictions around the United States, most notably in New York and in California, here in New York, Berkeley, Santa Monica, the Bay Area. And it has been an experiment which has horribly failed. If affordable housing is the goal, then rent control simply does not work. Like all other examples of price controls, rent regulations result in less, not more, affordable housing. This is simple economic 101. When government sets price controls on anything, we get less of it. If you set price controls on gasoline, you get less of it. Price controls do not work with commodities, and they do not work with housing. We feel very strongly that the elimination of price controls will foster both the creation of new affordable housing. It now becomes an attractive investment. In the absence of rent regulations, venture capital is more attracted to those areas. If you look at where people who invest in income-producing properties with their major corporations or small business, would you invest in a jurisdiction that had rent regulations, knowing that every time you wanted to increase your rent, you had to appear before some bureaucratic nonsense rent stabilization board? No, that's not where venture capital goes. And we implement our phase out of rent regulations through what we call permanent vacancy decontrol, which is if a tenant is currently under the protection of a rent regulation right now, and they will have the benefit of that rent regulation as long as they are in that unit, but as soon as they vacate, that unit is permanently decontrolled. It can go to market rate. That was a political decision that we made because we know the other side is going to show pictures of little old ladies being tossed out of their mobile home parks in their wheelchairs. We want to be able to say credibly, truthfully, that no one will be thrown out of either their mobile home park space or their apartment as a result of the passage of this initiative. Does it mean that there may be in 20 years some handful of people that are still under the benefit of a rent control regulation? Yes. But over time, these rent stabilization boards, which exist really to sustain their own bureaucrats, will be phased out of business. In all fairness, what we do in our California Property Owners and Farmland Protection Act is nothing radical. We'll be accused of doing something radical, but what we're doing is not radical at all. It is simply returning the state of property rights in California to the original vision, if you will, of our founding fathers. Thank you.